So let's start with a scary thought. Jesus said his disciples should do two things. They should preach the gospel and heal the sick. Luke 9, chapter 2. Those were his instructions. And we all have to assume that if we're his followers today, this is what we must do. We must preach the gospel and we must heal. What? That sounds ridiculous. Preaching the gospel? Keeping the story of Jesus alive? Sharing our faith? Well, we might be able to tick that box, even if we might wonder how well we do it. But we could give that the benefit of the doubt and say that this is one of the things that the church does do. It tells the story of Jesus, keeps that story alive. But heal? We can't do that. There may be some of us who are trained doctors and nurses, but that leaves everybody else out. How can we heal people? When we think of Jesus healing, we think of Jesus being clearly in another world. And in fact, in many ways, Jesus was in another world. A world where much less was known in terms of medicine or infection or disease. And in the actual words of the Bible, there's the lazy use of the term leprosy to cover all kinds of different skin diseases. There's a belief in evil spirits. There's no understanding of something like epilepsy. There's not much knowledge of mental illness. But even the most sceptical of historians agree that Jesus was known as a healer. These kinds of people were quite common in the ancient world and in Bible times. There are so many accounts, so many different accounts of Jesus healing in the Bible. It's pretty certain that he did. One proof of that is the reactions of the people who were against Jesus, the ones who didn't support him, the ones that wanted him stopped. If the disciples were making up stories about healings that didn't actually take place, why did Jesus' opponents not start to question that? Why didn't they question the facts of the healing? But instead what happened was that those who were against Jesus tried to make out that Jesus had some special power and that it didn't come from God. Jesus had been dabbling in black magic. Jesus was in the service of the evil one. And that's what they did. They never spent any time disputing these healings took place. If you look at the Gospel of John, the writer of John picks seven healings of Jesus, or miracles and healings, which he calls the 7 signs. And I guess he picked these ones because they were so dramatic. So if you read through John, you'll find the 7 signs. The first one's in John chapter 2. Jesus turns water into wine. Then there's the healing of the official's son in John chapter 4. There's the healing at the pool of Bethesda on the Sabbath, which you'll find in John chapter 5. Then in John chapter 6, the 4th sign is the feeding of the 5,000. And in the same chapter, walking on water. And then the 6th sign is when Jesus heals the man born blind and gives him sight. That's in John chapter 9. And finally in John chapter 11, when Lazarus is raised from dead. You and I can't do things like that. Those healings and these miracles were seen as pointers to the world that Jesus is special, that people should really pay attention to him. As John says, they were signs that God was working through Jesus. But, they were also potentially dangerous. And the danger was that the healings and the miracles themselves become the most important thing. In our reading this morning, we heard that Jesus, who's just beginning his ministry and just called the first fishermen to be his followers, that they arrive in a town called Capernaum, and Jesus gets a chance to speak at a synagogue. And so he ends up preaching, and then, having been accosted by someone with mental health issues, who tries to pick a fight with him, Jesus dramatically heals the man. So there's both preaching the gospel and healing in one single incident. Now imagine if you had been there on that day at that scene in Mark chapter 1. What would you remember most? Would you remember most the preaching of Jesus or the healing of the man? I hardly need to ask. Even Mark, who tells us that Jesus taught with authority, never tells us anything that Jesus said, but he relates what happened with the healing. And Jesus was always aware of this. Healings and miracles could do good things, achieve good outcomes, but there was always a danger that people would start following Jesus just to be entertained. And of course, there were times when that actually did happen, when people did follow him just for that reason. Here's Jesus coming today. Let's go and see him. Not because we care about his teaching, not because we want to listen to his challenging message, but let's go and see if there's any drama or some magic tricks from Jesus today. So what am I saying here? Jesus could heal people in sometimes dramatic and sometimes very quiet ways, and we can't heal. Jesus and us were well different, so we don't need to worry about what Jesus said about us being healers. No, that's not what I'm saying. We might not be able to perform miracles, but there's plenty of healing that happens around the world each day. It's not miraculous, but it's real. And you know, there's a sense in which you could say that everything that Jesus was about was to do with healing. Jesus' entire ministry was about healing. Now, in our broken world, there's many types of healing, not all physical or medical. Healing can mean curing, but it's not the same as curing. Sometimes we can be healed without being cured. Some things we have to find ways to live with. And I guess the classic example of this is the fact that we will all die one day. No one will escape this. Some years back, I was conducting worship in my first congregation in Gorbals. And I noticed that there were two people sitting out in the seats in the middle of the congregation who had never seen before. And after the service, they were waiting to speak to me. And they said, "We are from the Prince and Princess of Wales Hospice." In the early days, that was in Carlton Place down at the River Clyde. Gorbals was the local church. The hospice was in Gorbals Parish. So they said, "You're our local minister. We've come to see you to ask if you will consider being our chaplain." And they offered to take me on a tour of the hospice. So I'm going to cut all the bull here and tell you the truth about what happened next, because it's quite embarrassing for me to admit to this. But I was getting shown around the place, and they were explaining everything that was going on. And I kept hearing them using the word healing, again and again. And so I said to them something like, I try and let myself off by saying I was young, but I said to them something like, "Why do you keep talking about healing here? Everybody here is going to die." And they looked at me with some surprise and patiently explained what goes on in a hospice. The healing that the hospice movement works towards is where a person who's terminally ill can come to terms with that situation and makes peace with it. Makes peace with their family, makes peace with God, makes peace with themselves, and can finally accept the fact that they're going to die and actually have peace of mind about it. That's the healing. It's the ability to face death peacefully without regret and fear. And it's a wonderful thing. And over the next few years, while I acted as their chaplain, I learned a lot about healing. Sometimes we can be healed and made whole without having a cure for our situation. Now, it seems to me that healing was not just something that Jesus did in particular occasions. Healing is what Jesus was about from beginning to end. Jesus was all about healing divisions, political, social, economic, healing the divided self within all of us, healing relationships between people and their neighbours, healing the relationship between us and God, breaking down the barriers that shut people out, making sure everyone was included, encouraging people to know that they mattered and that they were important and they had something to offer. All of this is healing. And very often, even with Jesus' physical healings, the person concerned, the ill person, had also been cast off from normal society, forced out from their community, their work, their home, their family, even from worship. And Jesus was able to restore all those different broken relationships in one go. Every one of us has the ability to bring people hope, to give encouragement and support, to be a listening ear, helping people as they try and work through their problems, giving time to be alongside somebody who's in a bad situation, offering ideas or showing compassion. We can all do that. When I was training to be a minister, in some of the early days I worked in a church called St Mark's Old Hall, and I was part of a group of friends who lived in that area. And one day the father of one of those girls died. And when the minister found out I knew the daughter well, he sent me to go and speak to the family, to the bereaved mother. I was to be the official church visitor. And I'd never done anything like that before. I had no idea what to say. But I realised I couldn't exactly think I could ever be a minister if I wasn't able to visit someone who was bereaved. So I just had to go and do it. And I remember the details of that visit only vaguely. I remember not knowing what to say. I remember big silences. And I remember stumbling away from the house afterwards and feeling embarrassed, like a complete failure. Since that day, I have met Mrs. Ferrier a couple of times, literally walking down the street because she lives quite near my mum. And when that happens, we stop and we say hello and we have a short conversation. And just as the conversation is ending, every time, she grabs my arm and there are tears in her eyes. And she thanks me profusely for that wonderful visit all those years ago and tells me again just how much that meant to her. And I can't think what on earth I said or did. It seems like all I did was to show up. And maybe somehow that was enough. We have to realise that there's more to healing than performing operations or handing out pills. When we take time to be with someone who's hurting, we're helping them to heal. And when we listen to somebody describing their fears or their dilemmas, we can be helping them to heal. When we say yes to a gay couple who's come to our church in their final attempt to find acceptance and a welcome in a church community, we are bringing healing to them. When we bring clothes or groceries to a food bank or a homeless shelter, we're helping to heal the inequalities and divisions in our society. One other thing I'd like to mention is prayer. Prayer is possible for all of us, wherever we find ourselves. My father died. He worked virtually his entire life as a church minister. He was very well known, and a large church building was filled to the rafters for his funeral. And I had to stand up and say a few words about my dad. It was a daunting and a serious moment, trying to capture in my words this man who I'd known my entire life and somehow do him justice. So I was feeling a bit nervous. And I stood up and I looked out at this sea of faces. Many I knew very well, some people I didn't know at all. And I got myself ready to open my mouth. And as I did that, I became aware of something. And it's funny to explain what it was I sensed. It was God. It was certainly God. But somehow my sense told me it was something very specific. It was prayer. As I looked out over that crowd, I realised that people were praying for me and for my stepmom and for my two sisters and my family. And they had been over these days. And at that moment, I felt like God was holding me up through the prayers of so many people. God was holding me, and it was through the prayers of others. Now, I've never had that particular feeling before about prayer, but I know it was real. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the power of prayer comes down to the amount of people that are praying at any one time, like it's a mathematical formula, or it's like a petition where there has to be a minimum number of people for God to pay any attention. As if God only acts when people join in, or where enough people join in, or as if God only acts reluctantly at all. I don't believe any of that for 1 minute. But I do know that I was aware of the prayers at that moment. And I don't understand what goes on when we pray, and why it sometimes makes such a difference and sometimes seems to make no difference at all. I have no idea how that works. But I just knew then, and I know now, that prayer is one way that brings healing and support into situations that can transform them for the better. When we pray as individuals and as a church community, we may not understand how that works. It may always remain a mystery. But we can be sure that it makes a difference for good. It's just one more way that any one of us can involve ourselves in healing. In our words and in our actions, and through our prayers, we can act as healers in the world, just as Jesus did. And we can be a healing community. Can we do spectacular miracles? Probably not. But we can all, in our own way, be healers every day of our lives. Thanks be to God.